Imagine being 15 years old, dressed in fine silk, believing you're about to step into a life of luxury. You're told you're being escorted to a wedding ceremony, a day of celebration. But instead, the doors close behind you not for privacy but for control. You're not here for love, you're here to obey. This is the fate of the daughters of Ottoman sultans, a fate hidden behind closed doors erased from history. What they were forced to endure was not just a wedding night, it was a life of torment. What happened to these princesses wasn't just abuse, it was an empire's most carefully guarded secret, a system so brutal it left no room for escape. And it's time to reveal the hidden truths. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, stretching across 3 continents, from the streets of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen. Its rulers commanded vast armies and conquered entire cities, but within the walls of their palaces a darker truth was hidden, one that few ever knew. Behind the splendor and glory of imperial rule, in the shadowy recesses of the harem, the daughters of the sultans lived lives of silence and submission. The women of the palace weren't just royalty, they were tools of power, pawns in a political game that began long before their birth. Their futures were not their own. Their bodies, their voices, their lives were all controlled for the empire's benefit. But while the sultans reigned over their empire, their daughters were forced to live within a system designed to break them. Not with physical chains, but with silence, obedience, and isolation. Their suffering, so hidden from the public eye, was so brutal, even the empire's greatest enemies would never have wished it upon their own children. What happened behind the palace walls was a fate far worse than death. As we dive deeper into this hidden history, we want to hear from you. If you're shocked by the untold stories of the Ottoman princesses, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more people learn about the forgotten truths of the past. And let us know where you're watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How does this hidden history resonate with you? Because the more we uncover, the more we realize how much has been kept in the shadows. The imperial harem wasn't just a royal residence, it was a psychological battlefield. For the daughters of the sultans, this was their entire world. A world where every breath was scrutinized, every word measured, and every movement monitored. There was no freedom here, no sanctuary from the watchful eyes of the court, no space for self-expression. Inside these walls, obedience wasn't just expected, it was demanded. The slightest deviation from the prescribed rules could bring severe punishment, sometimes public humiliation, sometimes isolation in the cold, damp chambers beneath the palace. Here, the only thing that mattered was control. Every gesture, every step, every glance was part of a carefully constructed system. The princesses were trained from an early age to never question, to never show defiance. They were taught that their worth was not in their intelligence, their beauty, or their spirit, but in their ability to submit to the empire's will. From the moment they were born, the daughters of the sultans were destined to live lives of invisible chains. Their childhoods were not spent in the carefree exploration of the world or the nurturing of their minds and imaginations. No, their lives were dictated by an unyielding system, one designed to strip away their identities and replace them with an obedience that could be manipulated at will. This was the sacred education, a process so carefully orchestrated that even the strongest wills were ultimately broken. In the soft, dimly lit chambers of the harem, these princesses were not allowed the luxury of being children. The lessons they learned were not about knowledge or self-discovery, but about survival in an empire where power came at the expense of personal freedom. Every movement they made, every word they uttered, was carefully measured and corrected. A bow wasn't just a gesture of respect, it was an act of submission. Every bow had a purpose. Every word spoken had to fit within a rigid vocabulary designed to suppress individuality and reinforce their role as mere instruments of the empire. These girls were taught to bend, literally and figuratively, from an early age. Their instructors were stern, relentless figures who ensured that the princesses would never forget their place. The simplest action could be grounds for punishment if it wasn't done properly. A step could be too wide, a turn too sharp. The length of a pause, the angle of a gaze, nothing was too small to escape scrutiny. These weren't lessons in etiquette or grace. These were lessons in control, in making sure that the princesses would always know their place in the grand scheme of things. The concept of self was gradually erased, replaced by a singular purpose, to serve the empire. No longer were they daughters of sultans, princesses with the potential to rule or command. They were pawns created to forge political alliances, to seal agreements between empires, and to strengthen the empire's hold on power. They weren't meant to be thinkers or leaders. Their minds were not their own. Their futures were already decided, written by others, long before they were old enough to understand what it meant to live or love freely. At the heart of the sacred education was obedience. The princesses were taught that to question, to think outside of the empire's narrative, was not just a defiance. It was a crime against the very foundation of their existence. Each day, they practiced rituals of reverence. Each day, they learned how to kneel, how to bow, how to move with the subtle grace of a figure bound by invisible strings. But beyond these gestures, they were taught to believe that their thoughts and desires were secondary. The empire's needs, the empire's agenda, became their only truth. The sacred education didn't just shape their bodies, it warped their minds. The girls learned that their value was no longer tied to their intelligence, their beauty, or their potential. It was only in how they could serve, how they could mold themselves into tools that the empire could wield at its convenience. Even their emotions were not their own. The feelings they were permitted to express were carefully regulated. Anger, curiosity, or defiance were extinguished, while acceptance, submission, and sacrifice were elevated as the highest virtues. In the quiet corners of the harem, these young women would sometimes catch a glimpse of what life might have been, a life without rigid rules, without the suffocating pressure of constant surveillance. But those fleeting moments were short-lived. They were always brought back into the fold, reminded that their purpose wasn't to dream or to hope, but to exist within the system. The princesses were living symbols of power, yes, but they were also its prisoners, bound by the empire's unrelenting need to control, to manipulate, and to use them for its own gain. They were forced into a world where their voices were quieted, their opinions irrelevant. In this world, they were more valuable as bargaining chips, as instruments of diplomacy, than as individuals. And yet, through it all, they had no choice but to obey. To disobey was to risk everything, not just their place within the palace, but their very lives. The sacred education was not a path to greatness, it was a pathway to erasure. These girls, with their brilliance and potential, were molded to fit into a system that had no room for personal will. They became shadows of their former selves, walking in silence, bound by invisible chains, serving an empire that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. The sacred education did not just shape the princesses' bodies and minds, it shattered their very spirits. What was once a vibrant, curious young girl, eager to explore the world, became a shell of her former self. With every lesson in obedience, every gesture drilled into her, the life within her slowly began to fade. The palace, once a place of beauty and promise, became a prison of silence and submission. Alone in her room, a young princess would stare out at the expansive palace gardens, knowing she could never step beyond the walls. The sunlit world outside seemed so close, yet so distant, like a dream she could never touch. She watched the flowers bloom and the seasons change, but she was forever frozen in place, her movements controlled, her thoughts confined, and her voice stifled. There was no one to speak to, no one to confide in. The weight of isolation pressed down on her, suffocating any trace of individuality. The isolation was not just physical, it was psychological. Every day, these girls were subjected to constant surveillance, their every action scrutinized. No moment was private. Every glance, every whisper could be interpreted as an act of rebellion. It wasn't long before the constant pressure began to erode their sense of self. Slowly, the light in their eyes began to fade. Their once sharp minds, full of questions and dreams, became dulled. The curiosity that once defined them was extinguished, replaced by a quiet resignation. Some princesses stopped speaking altogether, their voices lost to a silence they could never break. The very act of speaking became a violation of the rules they had been taught to obey. Others withdrew into themselves, retreating into an internal world where even their own thoughts became foreign. The loneliness they felt was not just physical, it was emotional and mental, a deep, aching void that nothing could fill. In the eyes of the empire, they were never meant to be more than tools to further its power. But what was forgotten was the human cost of this system, the toll it took on their hearts and minds. What good was power if it left behind only broken, silent women? What use was obedience if it led to the destruction of everything that made a person whole? For these princesses, the price of their obedience was the erasure of their very identity. Their dreams were stolen from them, replaced by a life of dutiful submission. And as the years passed, the emotional scars grew deeper. Some never recovered, their spirits crushed beyond repair. They were no longer daughters of sultans, they were ghosts, walking silently through the corridors of a palace that no longer felt like home. The moment every princess dreaded had finally arrived, the night of her wedding. But it was not the joyous occasion that one might imagine. There was no love, no celebration. Instead, it was a cold, calculated ritual carefully orchestrated to strip her of the last remnants of herself. The bridal chamber, dimly lit with flickering candles, seemed like a place of sacred union, but to the princess it felt more like a tomb. She stood alone, shivering in her wedding gown, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The gown, elegant in its design, felt suffocating, as though it were weighing her down, reminding her of her place. It wasn't a symbol of love, it was a symbol of ownership, of control. Her body, her mind, and her spirit were no longer hers to command. They had been claimed by the empire, and now, in this chamber, she would become the final piece of the puzzle. The preparations had been ritualistic, forced, and humiliating. Her every move had been rehearsed, her every word measured, her every action scrutinized. She was no longer a young woman with hopes and dreams. She was a living instrument of diplomacy, a tool used to seal an alliance. The act of marriage, instead of a bond between two people, was reduced to nothing more than a transaction, a way to solidify power and control. In the days leading up to the wedding, every detail had been attended to with ruthless precision. The rituals, the prayers, the symbolic acts, all of them designed to erase any shred of autonomy she might have had. Her body had been prepared not for love but for submission. She had been conditioned to see herself not as a partner, but as an object, something to be used to serve the empire's needs. And now, as she stood there in that bridal chamber, the culmination of her entire life of obedience loomed before her. What awaited her in the bedchamber was not a tender union, but a brutal assertion of power. The wedding night was meant to break her completely, to erase any remaining resistance, to remind her that she was nothing more than a living symbol of the empire's strength. As the doors to the chamber closed behind her, she could feel the weight of the entire empire pressing down on her shoulders. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the celebrations that continued outside, unaware of the personal devastation taking place inside. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological violence that would unfold. In that room, the princess was not a bride. She was a vessel to be consumed by the empire, her body, her mind, her soul, all sacrificed to maintain the illusion of power. What should have been an intimate, private moment became a ritual of control, a test to see just how far she could be pushed before she broke. This wasn't a wedding night. It was the final, crushing step in the system of manipulation that had shaped her entire existence. She had been prepared to accept her fate without resistance, but in that moment, as the reality of what was happening sank in, the last trace of her will to fight began to die. The empire had won. Take the story of Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed, a woman whose name was once synonymous with brilliance and potential. As a young girl, Fatma was unlike any other princess. She was sharp-witted, ambitious, and filled with a boundless curiosity about the world around her. Her eyes sparkled with a hunger for knowledge, and she devoured books in Arabic and Persian, immersing herself in subjects like astronomy, history, and law. Her tutors marveled at her intellect, and chroniclers spoke of her discipline and insight. Fatma wasn't just the daughter of a powerful sultan, she was a mind to be reckoned with. But none of this mattered in the grand scheme of things. From the moment she was born, Fatma's fate was sealed. She was thrust into a world where her brilliance, her talents, and her ambitions had no place. The empire needed her, yes, but not for her mind. It needed her for one purpose: to seal alliances and ensure the stability of the sultan's rule. Her life, her very existence, was to be a tool used to further the political goals of the empire. She wasn't allowed to dream of ruling or leading. She wasn't allowed to decide her own fate. Instead, Fatma was molded into a figure whose worth was determined solely by the political advantages she could offer. As she grew older, the palace walls grew tighter around her. Fatma was no longer allowed the freedom to study or explore the world outside. Instead, she was groomed for one purpose alone: marriage, but not for love. Love was never part of the equation. Fatma was married off not because of mutual affection or a shared bond, but because it was time to secure an alliance. The man chosen for her was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a military commander, hardened by years of war and political maneuvering. He was nearly 20 years her senior, and his marriage to Fatma was not one of passion but of power. For him, it meant advancement, proximity to the throne, and influence over the empire's future. For her, it meant being reduced to a pawn in a game she never wanted to play. Fatma's days of intellectual curiosity, of fiery debates with scholars and discussions on the stars, were replaced by a life of strict obedience. Her ambitions, her voice, her very spirit were slowly erased. In the name of the empire's needs, Fatma was groomed not for love but for submission. The sacred education was a brutal preparation, one designed to break even the strongest of minds. The lessons of silence, submission, and unwavering discipline were drilled into her day after day. Fatma was trained to never question, never challenge, and always obey. Her every move, every glance was controlled. The girl who once gazed at the night sky with wonder was now forced to become a living symbol of the empire's power. Her mind, once free and vibrant, began to dull, as every piece of her was molded to fit the rigid framework the empire had laid out for her. When the time came for her marriage to Kara Mustafa, Fatma was not a bride filled with hopes and dreams. She was a piece of property, a political tool, and the grand ceremony that was meant to celebrate her union was, in reality, the final crushing step in the system that had shaped her life. The girl who had once questioned, who had once dared to dream, was now a prisoner, bound by duty, her future dictated by the empire's needs. Fatma Sultan's story is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of countless daughters who lived under the shadow of the Sultan's power. It is the tale of how ambition, intelligence, and curiosity were systematically destroyed, replaced by a forced silence and obedience that allowed them no voice, no choice, and no freedom. In the end, Fatma was no longer the vibrant, curious princess who once dreamed of the stars. She was a pawn in a game that she could never win, her spirit slowly fading into the background of the empire's grand narrative. The day of Fatma's wedding arrived, a day that was meant to be a joyous occasion, filled with music, laughter, and the promises of a bright future. To the outside world, it was a celebration, one that marked the union of two powerful figures, the daughter of Sultan Ahmed and the esteemed military commander Kara Mustafa Pasha. The grand halls of the palace were alive with festivity, filled with dignitaries and nobles who came to witness this union of political significance. But to Fatma, this day wasn't a celebration, it was a sentence. In the bridal chamber, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The soft flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on the walls as Fatma stood, still and silent, surrounded by attendants who moved with practiced efficiency. They helped her into the bridal gown, their hands steady, but their eyes never meeting hers. Her every movement was observed, her every breath weighed. The heavy silence of the room seemed to mirror the crushing weight of her fate. The world outside may have been celebrating, but in this chamber Fatma was already condemned. She had been prepared for this moment, taught to surrender herself entirely, to let go of any trace of resistance or desire. Every part of her had been conditioned for this, her body, her mind, and her soul. But even after months of rigorous training, even after the endless days of obedience, Fatma was still a young woman, full of fear and uncertainty. This was not the beginning of a marriage, it was the final step in her destruction. What should have been a moment of union, of intimacy, was nothing more than a brutal act of domination. Fatma's body, already drained by the relentless conditioning, was now subject to the demands of the empire. She was not a bride in the traditional sense, she was a living seal of a political agreement, a symbol of power, and her body was no longer her own. The ritual that unfolded in that chamber was not one of love or connection. It was an act of complete control, designed to break any remaining shred of her will. Every action, every movement, every sensation was meant to strip her of her humanity, to remind her that her life, her body, were not hers to command. What followed wasn't the union of two souls, but a violation that left Fatma's spirit shattered. Her body did not respond as it should have. The years of mental and physical preparation had taken their toll. Her mind, already fragile, could not bear the weight of what was happening. In the eyes of the empire, this was the culmination of her purpose. But to Fatma, it was the final betrayal. It was the moment she was truly lost. The men who were part of this ritual, who had watched her break over the months, found themselves in the presence of something they had not expected. They had never imagined the depth of the trauma they were inflicting. As they witnessed Fatma's complete disassociation, her withdrawal from the reality of the moment, they understood too late what they had done. They had broken her beyond repair. The princess, once vibrant and full of potential, was now a hollow figure, her spirit crushed under the weight of the empire's demands. In that room, the wedding night that should have marked the beginning of a new chapter in Fatma's life, instead, marked the end of who she had once been. The trauma she endured that night stayed with her long after the celebrations had ended. For Fatma, and for many others like her, the wedding night wasn't a joyous occasion. It was a violent assertion of control, a brutal reminder that their lives were never their own. What should have been a sacred moment was reduced to a painful, irreversible act of domination, a reminder of the cruel system they were trapped in, with no escape in sight. In the days that followed, the grand halls of the palace seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of Fatma's suffering. The aftermath of that night was irreversible. Fatma, once sharp, inquisitive, and filled with an undeniable presence, had become a mere shell of who she once was. The vibrant young woman who had once debated scholars and dreamed of a future filled with purpose was now distant and hollow, her eyes clouded with confusion and pain. She spent her days in silence, locked in a room where the world outside felt unreachable. The vibrant gardens that had once filled her with wonder were now just a distant blur beyond her window, a reminder of everything she could never touch again. The oppressive isolation that had once been a part of her life now consumed her entirely. Fatma was no longer allowed to explore the world. She was a captive within the palace walls, a living ornament meant to be displayed for ceremonial purposes but never truly seen. The trauma of her marriage, of the brutality she had endured, left her physically alive but mentally absent. Her body functioned, but her spirit had retreated. She no longer spoke unless directly addressed, and even then her words came out in soft whispers as if they were foreign to her. The sharp, intelligent young woman who once captured the attention of everyone around her was gone. In her place was a broken figure, reduced to mere obedience, a ghost of her former self. Episodes of uncontrollable crying became her new reality. At times, the sorrow would overwhelm her, and she would weep without end, her chest heaving with the weight of emotions she could no longer process. There was no comfort, no release, just the endless spiral of despair. The once ambitious princess who had held so much promise was now lost to herself, trapped in a never-ending cycle of psychological torment. In the eyes of the empire, Fatma had fulfilled her role. She had been married, her duty to the empire's political needs secured. But what had been forgotten was the cost. She was no longer a princess with a future. She was nothing more than a living symbol of the empire's power, a token displayed to show the world the extent of the Sultan's influence. Her mind, her voice, her very identity were irrelevant now. She had been shaped, molded, and broken to serve the empire's needs, and in doing so she had been erased. The trauma didn't just stay with her, it consumed her slowly and quietly until there was nothing left but the remnants of what she had once been. Her marriage had taken away the very essence of who she was, leaving her to exist as a mere reflection of the power structures that had dictated her fate. For Fatma Sultan, the worst part of her life was not the physical abuse she had endured, but the psychological damage that had irreparably altered her mind and soul. The empire had won, and in the process it had destroyed her. She was no longer a person. She was a tool, a symbol, a living reminder of the power and control the sultans had over their own blood. And as the years passed, she remained trapped in the same prison, unable to escape the reality of what had been done to her. The princess was gone. In her place stood a broken woman, forgotten by history, hidden away in the shadows of the palace, her mind and heart lost forever to the empire's cruelty. For the princesses of the Ottoman Empire, there was no escape. Their lives were controlled by a system so brutal, it shattered their bodies, minds, and souls. These women, whose names were often lost to history, were trapped in a world where their value was reduced to nothing more than a tool to further the empire's power. But as we uncover these hidden stories, we realize that their suffering is not just a relic of the past. It's a reminder of how power can corrupt, how systems of control can strip individuals of their humanity. Fatma's story isn't just the story of an Ottoman princess. It's the story of anyone who has been silenced, who has been forced to conform to systems that demand obedience above all else. It's a story that resonates today in every corner of the world where power and control still dictate the lives of the oppressed. This history may have been buried for centuries, but the time has come to bring it to light. Let's ensure that the voices of these women, lost in the shadows of an empire, are finally heard. Share this video, reflect on the untold stories of the past, and let's continue uncovering histories that deserve to be remembered. Because when we listen to these stories, we honor not only their suffering but also their quiet acts of resistance, their strength, and their resilience.